Normandy, August 1944. The front had gone quiet for the night, but behind the lines the war was still alive. In the clatter of tools, the hiss of welding torches, and the smell of gasoline mixed with apple brandy. In a makeshift workshop near Saint-Lô, a squad of U.S. Army Ordnance mechanics worked under flickering lamps. The floor was mud, the walls were canvas, and every tank in the yard was half broken, half fixed. A Sherman sat in the center, engine open, panels stripped, wires dangling like veins. Its crew waited impatiently nearby, smoking, muttering. The tank had been sluggish all week, barely keeping up on the advance. Corporal Joe Tex Hargrove wiped oil from his hands, squinted at the Governor Assembly, and said what everyone was thinking. "Hell, maybe it's not broke. Maybe it's just too damn sober." Someone laughed. Someone else passed him a dented bottle of Calvados they'd liberated from a nearby village. They drank just a sip each, more ritual than indulgence. The war had been long, the nights longer. Then came the idea. "What if," Tex said slowly, "we just take the limiter out? Let her breathe." The others stared. The Governor wasn't supposed to be touched. It controlled the engine's maximum RPM, kept the M4's radial power plant from tearing itself apart. But curiosity and alcohol have the same fuel. Within minutes, they had the housing open. Bolts clattered into the mud. They adjusted the throttle linkage, rerouted the fuel line, and filed down a part they didn't entirely understand. One man held the flashlight. Another hummed Glenn Miller through his teeth. The tank looked like a patient under crude surgery. By dawn, they were exhausted, grinning, and not entirely sure what they'd done. When the engine roared to life, it sounded wrong, too sharp, too eager. The idle trembled. The crew climbed in for a test drive. They rolled the tank out of the tent, pressed the throttle, and the Sherman leapt forward like it had been reborn. 35 miles an hour down a dirt road, mud spraying, men shouting, laughter echoing over the hedgerows. From a nearby command post, an officer looked up in disbelief. What in God's name did they do to that thing? No one had an answer yet. But by sunset, everyone at the workshop had heard the same phrase whispered with a grin. The Calvados Special just outran a jeep. For decades, the story of Allied armor has been told as one of uniformity. Identical Shermans rolling from Detroit's factories, stamped, numbered, and painted in olive drab. The myth says the Americans won through mass production, not imagination. Every bolt, every part, identical. Every crew, replaceable. Every tank, the same. But the men who kept those tanks running knew better. Out on the front, nothing was standard. Once a Sherman left the factory floor, it entered a different world. A world of mud, shrapnel, heat, and human improvisation. Manuals meant little. Tools broke. Spare parts ran out. And so men started inventing. The public saw industrial perfection. The soldiers saw constant failure patched by instinct. To them, the tank wasn't a machine. It was a living thing that limped, coughed, and aged like they did. Mechanics didn't repair them. They kept them alive by whatever means worked. Welding, scavenging, even stealing from wrecks. The official record never mentions whiskey or luck. But both flowed through every field workshop. The U.S. Army Ordnance units were less like factories and more like jazz bands. Every man played by ear. When something broke, they didn't always fix it the right way. They fixed it the possible way. That was how the line between mistake and innovation blurred. The myth of uniformity was comforting. It implied control. But real war was chaos organized by hands and hunches. Every tank that rolled through Normandy had a story behind it. Missing bolts replaced by nails, fuel lines patched with medical tubing, armor welded from spare track links. And sometimes those field repairs didn't just work. They improved performance. The Calvados Special was the ultimate proof. Commanders thought it was a malfunction until they saw it accelerate past everything else on the road. The tankers swore it felt different, more responsive, more alive. In a war obsessed with mass production, a handful of grease-stained mechanics had built something no engineer designed, a faster Sherman, born out of fatigue, frustration, and brandy. The myth said Allied tanks were all the same. The truth was that by the time they reached the front, no two were alike. And sometimes the chaos of difference was exactly what made them unstoppable. Behind every Sherman that rumbled through France stood an invisible army of mechanics, welders, and machinists who fought their own kind of war. One fought with grease, mud, and sleep deprivation, instead of rifles. They were the men of the U.S. Army Ordnance. Their battlefield was the workshop. When the 3rd Armored Division landed in Normandy, it brought along an entire mobile maintenance ecosystem. Armored recovery vehicles, machine lathes bolted to trucks, spare engines stacked in the open, and tents that served as field foundries. Each maintenance battalion followed the tanks like a shadow army, setting up repair depots just miles behind the front. A single ordnance company could service 40 tanks a week. The 45th Ordnance Maintenance Battalion, attached to the 3rd Armored, had 200 men and enough equipment to rebuild a tank from its own wreckage. They called it Detroit in a ditch. Conditions were brutal. The ground near St. Lo was a swamp of churned earth and diesel. Rain never stopped. Shells landed close enough to shake the work tables. Mechanics slept in shifts, sometimes on engine decks, waking only when the next crippled tank rolled in on a wrecker. The line between routine and improvisation vanished almost immediately. There were never enough correct parts. Tanks that came in with broken suspension arms might leave with parts from another model entirely. Crews swapped transmissions between wrecks, cut up armor plating from destroyed vehicles, and rewired electrical systems using salvaged aircraft cable. Each mechanic carried a dog-eared copy of the technical manual, and ignored it. "We didn't fix them by the book," one veteran later said. "We fixed them by feel." They learned tricks factory engineers never imagined. Heating frozen pistons with blowtorches, hammering cracked gear teeth back into place, replacing fuel lines with medical tubing or Coca-Cola hoses. Their motto wasn't precision. It was persistence. And in that chaos, accidents were inevitable. Sometimes they broke more than they repaired, but once in a while, an error turned into a breakthrough. The Calvados Special came from that world. The workshop at St. Lo had seen too many dead engines, too many burned-out governors. The men were tired, cold, and drunk on fatigue. They wanted the tank to move faster, not because of strategy, but because they were sick of watching it stall in mud. They didn't know it, but when they pulled out that governor, they weren't just fixing a tank. They were rewriting the boundary between field work and engineering. War had turned them into something new. Accidental innovators. Every tank that fought in Normandy carried a secret battle inside its hull. A war between steel and friction. For all the talk of armor and firepower, the real killer of tanks wasn't always enemy fire. It was time, distance, and wear. The Sherman tank was built to be reliable, but Normandy destroyed machines faster than any battlefield before it. Dust-clogged filters, rain-soaked wiring, mud-jammed suspension bogies. Every hill burned fuel, every mile stretched metal. On paper, the M4's service life was 1,500 operational miles. In France, most didn't survive 200. The math of maintenance was brutal. A Sherman required an average of 26 hours of work for every 24 hours it spent moving. Field records from the 3rd Armored Division showed that 40% of all mechanical breakdowns came from the same two culprits, the carburetor governor and the fuel feed regulator. Those tiny components controlled the engine's heart rate, keeping the RPM low enough to preserve reliability. In theory, that saved engines. In reality, it strangled them. Crews complained constantly the tanks couldn't climb hills fast enough, couldn't keep up with advancing infantry, couldn't turn out of ambushes quickly. The engineers back in Detroit saw stability. The men in France saw slow death. And then came the numbers that commanders couldn't ignore. In July 1944 alone, more than 2,000 Shermans in the European theater were sidelined by mechanical failure, not combat damage. Of those, 80% were later repaired and returned to action by ordnance field teams. The system depended entirely on improvisation. Each ordnance unit tracked its own efficiency. The men joked about it like gamblers comparing odds. The best workshops boasted 30% faster turnaround than factory estimates, not through discipline, but through shortcuts. They worked with whatever they could find: French motor oil, melted down German tank treads, aircraft spark plugs. They cannibalized wrecks, welded scrap into armor, and wired fuel pumps from salvaged trucks. The result wasn't standardization. It was controlled chaos. Every tank became a prototype of itself. Every repair left fingerprints of ingenuity and exhaustion. So when one crew near Saint-Lô complained that their tank was as sluggish as a plow, the mechanics didn't reach for the manual. They reached for the wrench. They knew the governor was choking the engine. They'd seen it 100 times. But that night, fueled by fatigue and French brandy, they went one step further. They removed it. It wasn't doctrine, it was frustration turned into physics. And in that moment, war's greatest statistic, the endless grind of breakdown and repair, bent, just slightly, toward invention. It began after midnight, when the rain had stopped, but the mud still steamed. The mechanic's tent near Saint-Lô buzzed with the faint hum of generators and the pop of welding torches in the distance. The war never slept, and neither did the men who kept its machines alive. Corporal Joe Tex Hargrove stared at the Sherman sitting dead in front of him. Its crew had complained for days that the tank refused to climb hills, that its throttle response lagged, that it died like a tired horse. He'd already cleaned the carburetor twice, swapped the filters, and adjusted the throttle linkage. Nothing worked. He lit a cigarette, exhaled through his nose, and muttered, "Maybe she's just lazy." His partner, Private Collins, was elbow-deep in an engine casing. "Or maybe she's just got the governor hangover. Same as the rest of us." They both laughed. And that was when Tex said it, half a joke, half a dare. "Then hell, let's take the limiter out and see if she can still dance." Collins stared. "You serious?" Tex grinned. "Only one way to find out." They unbolted the housing that held the governor assembly, a delicate piece of engineering that Detroit engineers swore should never be touched. The governor's job was simple: keep the radial engine from spinning faster than safety allowed. But under field conditions, it also kept tanks sluggish, trapping them in narrow RPM bands. One by one, they pulled the pieces apart. Springs, linkages, a mess of screws they could barely see by lantern light. Each movement was half improvisation, half prayer. They didn't have replacement parts, so failure meant weeks of waiting. But caution had no place left in that tent. Somewhere behind them, someone opened a bottle of Calvados. A small toast was made to horsepower and poor decisions. They reassembled the system without the limiter, bypassing the regulation mechanism entirely. Tex adjusted the throttle cable until it felt right under his fingers. He didn't have instruments, only instinct. "Fire her up," he said. The engine coughed, backfired, then roared to life, louder, deeper, more eager than before. The exhaust flame flashed blue-white. The tachometer needle climbed higher than they'd ever seen it go. Collins yelled, "She's gonna blow." But she didn't. The engine settled into a hard, steady rhythm, like it had been waiting to breathe. At dawn, they decided to test it. The Sherman rolled out of the tent and onto the dirt road. Tex climbed onto the hull as the driver revved the throttle. The tank leapt forward. The gears howled. Mud sprayed in thick arcs behind it. 30 miles an hour, then 35. The mechanics laughed like lunatics. The driver shouted, "This ain't a tank. It's a damn race car." An officer in a nearby jeep slammed his brakes, staring in disbelief as the tank thundered past, kicking up a wake of mud and dust. By the time it skidded to a stop, the men were breathless, covered in grime, grinning like children. Tex slapped the armor plate. "Well, boys, I think we built something Detroit didn't." And from that morning on, every tank crew within earshot wanted to know one thing. What the hell had those drunk mechanics done to make a Sherman outrun a Jeep? When the sun came up over Saint-Lô, the officers weren't laughing. They stood by the road staring at the mud-splattered Sherman that had just outrun a jeep and sounded like it was about to lift off. The crew climbed out, faces split with exhausted grins. The engine still idled, rough but alive. Lieutenant Reynolds crossed his arms. "What did you idiots do to my tank?" Tex shrugged, wiping oil from his hands. "Just let her breathe, sir." It wasn't exactly wrong. By removing the governor, the mechanics had freed the engine from its built-in leash. The governor was designed to cap revolutions at around 2,400 RPM to protect against wear. Without it, the radial engine could push closer to 3,000. That small difference, roughly 25% more throttle response, meant the tank accelerated faster, climbed hills easier, and felt dramatically lighter on the controls. In mechanical terms, it was simple math: more revolutions per minute, more torque available at lower gears. But what fascinated everyone was that the tank didn't disintegrate. It held together, as if the machine itself had been waiting for permission to break its own rules. Word spread through the division faster than radio reports. Crews started asking their mechanics to Calvados tune their engines. Some tried it quietly. Others botched the job and blew pistons. The Ordnance Command caught wind of it within a week. They called the modification reckless and unsanctioned. But the results were impossible to ignore. Tanks with the Saint-Lô tune-up consistently showed 10 to 15% better performance in short-range maneuver trials. Engineers later confirmed that the M4's engine had a safety margin large enough to handle the extra stress. In other words, the limiter had been overly cautious all along. The field had found what the factory never dared to test. A few months later, Detroit Arsenal engineers quietly studied the reports. Some of those illegal adjustments would later influence post-war engine calibrations. The math of the accident was clear. One forbidden tweak, multiplied by exhaustion and alcohol, produced a 30-ton experiment that worked. Genius had nothing to do with it, just fatigue, frustration, and a spark of mechanical heresy. The legend of the Calvados Special spread faster than any order ever written. Within a week, every forward maintenance company in the 3rd Armored Division had heard about the tank that ran like a demon. The story changed with every retelling. Some said the mechanics poured whiskey into the radiator. Others swore they'd swapped in a fighter plane carburetor. None of it was true. But one thing wasn't rumor. The tank was faster. The 33rd Armored Regiment was the first to copy the modification. A crew at Isigny removed the governor from their M4A1 and tuned the throttle linkage with a hammer handle and 2 feet of baling wire. The result wasn't elegant, but when they tested it on a dirt road, the tank sprinted across the field like a greyhound. The driver yelled over the engine noise, "We just built the fastest tank in Europe!" Other units followed. Mechanics began experimenting with everything: carburetor jets, ignition timing, even swapping spark plugs from captured German trucks. The front line turned into a rolling laboratory fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and contraband brandy. By September 1944, the ordnance reports were full of field modifications. Tanks arrived at depots sporting welded-on armor plates made from spare track links, extra fuel tanks scavenged from wrecks, and bizarre contraptions welded to hulls, cages, racks, even makeshift mine rollers. Each idea started as an act of frustration. A crew stuck in mud welded spare track to the hull for traction. Another reinforced the side armor with sandbags and steel doors from a French barn. Nothing was official, but commanders quietly approved anything that worked. The 3rd Armored Division logged a 30% increase in operational uptime between August and October 1944. Not because of supply miracles, but because of what one after-action report called unsanctioned field ingenuity. Every division had its own folklore. The 2nd Armored bragged about a Sherman fitted with dual mufflers that sounded like an airplane. The 4th claimed they'd made a tank that could tow 2 others without overheating. Whether myth or fact, the atmosphere had changed. The men realized that war wasn't about following blueprints. It was about surviving them. One colonel inspecting the Calvados Special simply said, "If it works, it's regulation now." By the time winter came, the modification had become both a joke and a doctrine. The Third Armored's tanks were rougher, louder, and faster than when they'd landed in France. Each bore welding scars and crude initials scratched into the armor, the fingerprints of mechanics who had turned chaos into efficiency. The line between sanctioned innovation and drunken improvisation blurred completely. What began as one reckless midnight fix had become part of the Allied machine. It was no longer about genius. It was about survival that looked like genius from a distance. By the end of 1944, the rumor of the governorless Shermans had traveled farther than anyone expected, all the way back across the Atlantic. Somewhere between Antwerp and Detroit, the myth turned into paperwork. Reports from field maintenance officers described unorthodox modifications resulting in improved performance. No names, no alcohol, no laughter, just data. At the Detroit arsenal, the engineers didn't believe it. They had designed the M4 to precise tolerances, the governor included. It wasn't a safety net, they insisted. It was a necessity. A missing limiter should have meant catastrophic failure. But the reports kept coming. Tanks running smoother, accelerating faster, no engine failures. Someone finally wrote in the margin of a report, "Field conditions contradict theoretical limits." A small inspection team was dispatched to France. They expected chaos, and they found it. At a maintenance depot outside Liège, they met the mechanics. Mud-caked, oil-stained, eyes hollow from exhaustion. The Calvados Special itself sat nearby, patched and scarred, its armor scratched with the words, "Saint-Lô Special Number 1." When the engineers examined the engine, they were stunned. The governor was gone. Fuel lines rerouted. Carburetor timing manual. No safety adjustments, no precision machining. And yet, it worked. They asked Tex Hargrove how he'd done it. He shrugged and said, "Just took out what was holding her back." It was the simplest engineering explanation anyone had ever given. The team ran tests, measured acceleration, and recorded temperatures. The results were undeniable. Marginally higher power output, better throttle response, and slightly higher fuel consumption. All within safe limits. Detroit's engineers were embarrassed. For years they had tuned conservatively, afraid of overloading engines. The soldiers, without knowing the equations, had found the real limit by accident. When the team returned to the States, they filed a report under the title Field Performance Modifications, Governor Limiter Adjustment, Field Results. No mention of Calvados, no mention of luck, just numbers. Months later, design revisions appeared in official blueprints. The new M4A3E8 Easy 8 featured an upgraded engine governor with expanded RPM tolerance and a more responsive transmission. The field mistake had become factory doctrine. Detroit claimed credit. The mechanics who caused it never knew. By war's end, hundreds of Shermans left assembly lines with features inspired by frontline improvisation. Extended track armor, auxiliary fuel mounts, improved gear ratios. What began as a handful of drunk mechanics working in a muddy tent had rippled across an industrial empire. Innovation had not traveled downward from engineers to soldiers. It had crawled upward, from desperation to doctrine, from accident to architecture. In a war driven by blueprints, the front had proved it could redraw them. History would later tell the story differently. The reports filed in Washington spoke of adaptive field ingenuity and distributed engineering. The truth was much simpler and far messier. A group of exhausted mechanics, half drunk on apple brandy, broke a rule and stumbled into progress. Their accident didn't just make one tank faster. It exposed the heartbeat of total war, a machine so vast that even its smallest mistakes could create revolutions. The American war effort prided itself on precision, on the clean lines of Detroit factories and standardized parts. But perfection was a myth. The real strength of the Allied machine wasn't order. It was tolerance for chaos. That's what the Calvados Special proved. In the mud of Normandy, innovation wasn't born in laboratories, but in improvisation. The men who bent the rules kept the engines running. They found efficiency not through genius, but through defiance. The faster tank became a symbol of something larger, the genius of imperfection. Every weld scar, every scratched armor plate, every misaligned bolt told the same story, that war, for all its machinery, was still a human invention powered by mistakes. After the war, the myth endured. Some said the Calvados Special was destroyed near the Rhine. Others swore it made it to Germany and ran faster than ever. No one could prove it either way. But every mechanic who heard the tale recognized the truth behind it, that sometimes the difference between failure and innovation is a single night of frustration, courage, and too much brandy. When the world looked back, the story was written as an anecdote, a footnote in armored warfare. But inside that footnote lay the blueprint of modern engineering culture. Learn by breaking, fix by feeling, trust the field before the factory. The Calvados Special wasn't just a tank. It was proof that imperfection, under pressure, can outthink perfection. And maybe that's how wars are really won, not by design, but by accident refined into doctrine. The Calvados Special never appeared in any museum. No plaques, no photographs, no medals for the men who made it run faster than it should. It vanished into the churn of war like so many other machines, repaired, repainted, and eventually scrapped. But its legacy outlived steel. The lesson it left behind was simple. The front line always invents faster than the factory can approve. In every war, progress hides in the margins. In midnight experiments, broken tools, and accidents that somehow work. The drunk mechanics of St. Lo proved that human error multiplied by necessity becomes innovation. Because war doesn't reward genius, it rewards whoever keeps the engines running.